In June 2005, at the Gwangju Inhwa Academy for Deaf Children, teacher Mr. Jeon Eung-seop received a phone call. A parent on the line asked a question. My daughter's friend was sexually assaulted. What should we do? The girl's parents chose to contact Mr. Jeon rather than other teachers because their daughter said he was a kind-hearted and caring teacher. In fact, everyone only had positive things to say about Mr. Jeon. This might make you believe that the Inhwa Academy was a good school, but I'm sorry to say it was anything but. Mr. Jeon listened to the victim's story. She said, "My teacher, Mr. E, sends my friend to come get me each night, promising me snacks, but then sends my friend away when we get to his office. In his office, he hurts me." Welcome to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Thank you to my patrons for making this show possible. Join us on Patreon to support the show and find show merch. Show sources are also available for free because citing your sources is fundamental. Lastly, join us on Discord for movie nights of films based off of the real crimes we cover in our episodes. Links for these are in the description. There will also be a movie night for this episode as well. Warning, today's episode involves sexual assault of children, including the testimonies of the victims. Gratuitous descriptions of the violence will not be included. However, it may be considered disturbing. This episode involves victims who are deaf, hard of hearing, or have intellectual disabilities. Listener discretion is advised. Mr. Jeon had joined Inhwa Academy years prior, but he was one of only a small few teachers who knew and understood sign language. This was a school for deaf students, and the majority of teachers and faculty did not know any sign language. Most would believe this is an oversight that is inexcusable. However, the reason behind this is that the school was never intended to be a place of aid and rehabilitation for these students. Rather, it was just a business. A former student, Park Eun-hye, came to Inhwa in elementary school after she experienced significant hearing loss at the age of 7. She didn't know sign language and was trying to learn to communicate with the other students, who all spoke to each other using sign. At first, she could only spell using alphabet signs, but later she slowly learned how to communicate more effectively using Korean Sign Language. She started to hate going to Inhwa Academy because the materials they learned were so simple. She could learn faster if she just taught herself. Many of the teachers did not know sign language, rather they could only sign some basic words. There were different levels of fluency for teachers, ranging from basic words to some teachers who were fluent. She only ever truly learned from the teachers who communicated in her language. The source of greed behind the Inhwa Academy was owned and operated by Usak Corporation, which was led by Chairman Kim. His full legal name was protected in this case and not public. The school was built in 1965 as a rural school until 1981, when it was redesigned to be a school specifically for deaf middle school students. The next year, in 1982, the school obtained a permit to expand and accept students from kindergarten to 8th grade. This was also when they established the dormitories on campus. Many of their students were orphans or students whose families sent them to live on campus. To open the kindergarten, they needed to tear down some of the walls and expand the building to accommodate the new classrooms. But Chairman Kim was incredibly cheap. He didn't want to pay for labor, so he used the workers that he had access to, not the teachers, but the children. The elementary and middle school students were given construction equipment overseen by the chairman and his family as they tore down walls and built the new classrooms. Many students were injured on the construction site, with injuries ranging from infected cuts to broken bones. This would only be the beginning of the Kim family's disregard for disabled children that they were expected to care for. The renovation of the school also was not cheap, and to offset the costs, Chairman Kim and his sons sent the students out into public spaces to put on busking performances to raise funds under the guise of donations for the school. Deaf and hard of hearing students were made to put on sign language performances and beg for money, none of which would be used to improve the school, the supplies, or their education. The public had no idea about the mistreatment the students were receiving because there were so many smiling pictures of the students next to large donations that were brought in. Some people donated school supplies or new equipment for the school, and promptly a picture would be taken with the smiling child thanking the donor. But before the item could collect any dust, it would be taken and sold for money. When Usuk Corporation re-established the school as a social welfare school, they received 36 billion won in funding from the government, most of which went to line the pockets of Chairman Kim and his two sons, who were working as Principal Kim Kang-seok and Vice Principal Kim Kang-jun. Principal Kim was influential in his community. He was seen as a charismatic man who was charitable and passionate about his school. In his free time, he was often at church. He was a church deacon, and that helped him gain a lot of trust in his neighborhood. Over the next few years, they worked to apply for permits to increase the number of students that their school could host, therefore increasing the money that they received from the government. By 1994, the school was allowed to have 150 students, many of whom the school fabricated that they had. But they also knew that increasing the student body to include high school students, they could increase the school's funding even more. So they applied in 1994 and were approved to open high school classes as well. Inhwa Academy had been lying to the public and the parents, because they didn't know that until 1994, they weren't legally allowed to have high school students. But they had high school students since 1982, and all of the diplomas they had handed out in that time were meaningless pieces of paper that they just stamped themselves. None of the students who received them were legally high school graduates, and these students wouldn't discover this until the start of the trial to come. Before we learn more about the trial, I think it's important to recognize the irony of the school's name, because Inhwa is a Confucian pedagogy that can be summarized to mean maintaining harmony. According to J.P. Aston and their works regarding Inhwa in the workplace, this concept comes from extreme Confucianism that was introduced by China to Korea in 108 BC as a way to control Korean citizens and discourage individuality. You might still see this in Korea today because Korea is a very homogeneous society. It is evident in business and customer service culture. Korea is, today, considered the most Confucian nation in the world. Often, disturbing others' peace or giving bad news is so dreadful you might see someone apologizing profusely for even minor inconveniences. You might be even given a gift or something free for a minor issue at a store. This is because Confucian belief is that emotional behavior is unseemly and embarrassing. Inhwa mostly existed to teach lower-class citizens to maintain peace between each other and to treat higher-class citizens with authority. For example, treating your boss as equal to your own grandparents in formality and respect. This system existed within the special education school only to benefit the faculty, who would go on to abuse the children. Back with Mr. Jeon, learning about the assault, he met with the victim and her family. He communicated in sign language to the victim, whose dominant method of communication was sign language. Mr. Jeon himself was hard of hearing and learned sign language as a child. He grew up in a much different circumstance than even the generation of his own students. He grew up without disability support or accommodations, but he wanted to ensure that that was not how it was going to be in the future. He took the girl's report seriously and listened to her describe being bribed into the vice principal's office with snacks or money. What she reported happening to her was something she struggled to describe. She didn't know the signs for these heinous acts. A little girl shouldn't know these words. The word she was looking for was rape. Mr. Jeon called the school nurse and told her about the assault. The nurse said that she'd known about it and told him not to tell anyone else. She said she'd try to resolve the problem. So he waited. He waited for 2 weeks and heard nothing. So he visited her office and asked the nurse, How are you resolving this? She got so angry and told him to leave, telling him she told him to never speak of this again. Mr. Jeon was confused. He refused to let this victim down. He had promised the family he would take the report seriously, so he called the principal to arrange a meeting. Although he knew the principal was the brother of the accused vice principal, he hoped that his report would be dealt with seriously. When he sat in front of the principal, he explained the situation and stated that the parents wanted to report the incident to the police. Principal Kim leaned in close and told him, "Be quiet." He told Mr. Jeon to never speak of this again and to tell the family to stop spreading this rumor. It was a very vague conversation that he had with the principal, and it was clear to him that this situation had already been known about and that it would not be taken seriously unless they involved the police or an external party. Mr. Jeon would later say that he had such an uneasy feeling in his stomach about the situation that he felt he needed to trust his gut and that this was not a standalone situation. He had actually heard rumors of misconduct with students but never seen anything himself. Because he was lower on the rung of the hierarchy, he kept his head down, but this guilt was now too much for him to bear. His next steps were to reach out to some of his former students who graduated in the high school program. The students confirmed his fears. This was not an isolated incident. The students had heard of others who had been harassed, abused, or sexually assaulted by staff members while living at Inhwa Academy. Mr. Jeon decided that he needed to record the victim's testimony, so he called the girl's parents again and asked if he could record a video of her giving her testimony to show to a counseling center, and they agreed. He brought the video to the Gwangju Sexual Violence Against Disabled People Counseling Center. He reported everything that the girl told him as well as showing them the video. This would be the start of a very twisted labyrinth of secrets hidden inside the halls of Inhwa Academy. The case officially started on June 21st, 2005. The victim was a middle school aged girl, and she was approached by the counseling center and offered free counseling. Upon hearing about what had happened to her, the director of the counseling center immediately reported the case to the police. Mr. Jeon could only hope that the girl was all right, but then rumors began to circulate amongst the staff at the school. School administration had heard about his involvement in reporting the incident, and because the student lived on campus away from her parents, someone in the faculty approached her in the dormitory. The student could not leave the dormitory to escape retaliation and had experienced constant harassment from staff since they discovered that the incident was reported. In fact, she would live on campus for 15 months after she reported the crime. She couldn't escape her rapist. The vice principal approached her and told her that he and some of the other administration were taking her to the cafeteria. She couldn't say no to them. She's a scared, traumatized preteen girl in the care of child abusers. In the cafeteria, the adult men made her repeat what she had told to Mr. Jeon. The men forced her to begin drinking copious amounts of alcohol until she could barely walk. But they started telling her to repeat after them. Repeat, "I wasn't sexually assaulted," and "Mr. Jeon Eung-seop made me falsely report that I was assaulted." They kept her out into the late hours of the night until they returned her to the dormitory and shoved a camera in her face. They told her, "Tell the police what you told us." Still drunk, she tried to repeat what they had coached her to sign, struggling through each sentence. The vice principal wanted this case to be thrown out easily, and since it was clear the police didn't really want to investigate anyways, this might be all that they needed. If the police accepted this, maybe the rest of their crimes could be overlooked. You might think that it would be obvious that this video was taken under duress, and it clearly was, but the police stalled their investigation nevertheless. The officers stated that the conflicting testimonies were enough to confuse the investigation enough, which halted it for 6 more months. After this, 2 graduates from Inhwa had heard about the situation and contacted the police to testify that they had witnessed some part of the sexual assault committed by the vice principal. Meanwhile, Vice Principal Kim asked to meet with Mr. Jeon outside of the school for coffee to try to persuade him to rescind his report. The vice principal told him, "I'll give you anything you want," but Mr. Jeon was a good person, and he wouldn't give in to such corruption, so he refused. Everyone at the school was looking down on him. It seemed that 4 out of 5 teachers were in on it. He couldn't believe so many teachers had known. As more and more people found out that he was the person who reported it, a second student came to him. She came to his office before he went home, a little after 8 p.m., and asked if she could talk to him. The girl told him, "I know it's disgusting to talk about, but please listen to me." She told him that the vice principal had also hurt her. He had taken her into a bathroom and, in her words, done something so obscene she didn't even know the language for it. Mr. Jeon was working with the counseling center at this point and also reported this girl's testimony. But He wouldn't return to work because this led to his unfair dismissal, which he wouldn't be able to fight right now. Because he was fired, he couldn't receive unemployment benefits, so he started a petition to the Labor Relations Commission, stating that he was fired because he reported corruption. The commission sided with him, and he was given his job back in July 2006, a year after he reported the incident. The vice principal and many of the staff had made it their life's goal to make his life a living hell. The school tried to file a lawsuit against him, stating that he was causing trouble in the workplace by filing false reports. They even had a school social worker following Mr. Jeon around everywhere he went, even the bathroom. He recalled that every single other teacher bullied him relentlessly, except for a few. You might think, why would he even return to that school? He would say that he couldn't abandon the children. His calling was to help children who felt misunderstood because of their disabilities, the way he felt when he was a child. As long as there were students at this school, he wanted to help them. The school's disciplinary committee eventually decided to fire him once again, but in the next few years, Mr. Jeon Eung-seop would go on to receive the Stepping Stone Award from the National Sexual Violence Counseling Center for his contributions for bringing the Inhwa Academy case to the world's attention. But that wouldn't be until after this case was done. Back in 2005, on July 6th, the community had just learned about the girls' report and came together to form the Inhwa Academy Sexual Violence Countermeasure Committee. By November, NBC's PD Note had aired an episode titled The Hidden Truth, Special Education Schools Sexual Violence Incident. They decided to send journalists to investigate the situation themselves. This is when the incident became known to the entire nation. The public was outraged by the incident and demanded answers. The police arrested the vice principal and faculty members on charges of sexual assault. The National Human Rights Commission of Korea was conducting their own investigation. They discovered that between 2000 and 2005, there were 9 victims, including elementary, middle, and high school students. These victims reported 6 different perpetrators amongst the staff. The youngest victim was only 6 or 7 in Korean age. Each of the victims reported that the sexual abuse they experienced was chronic and over a long period of time. The students at Inhwa Academy joined the protests. They refused to attend classes until the perpetrators were removed from the school. At this point, students had come forward totaling 59 victims, some current and many alumni of the school. The crimes dated back to the school's very opening. Unfortunately, for most of the victims, the crimes against them had reached its statute of limitations. The investigators really wanted to know how this was hidden for so long. But the victims were all living on campus in dormitories supervised by their perpetrators. They had very little contact with outside of the school, and many of them had hearing or intellectual disabilities, which made it challenging for them to advocate for themselves to trusted adults, many of whom did not know sign language. Even if the teacher did know sign language, reporting sexual abuse as a child is incredibly difficult, especially when you've been threatened to keep quiet. Some parents came forward about their children attending Inhwa Academy. Most of these families had no choice but to send their children to live there because they were the only special education school for deaf students within hours. One parent who sent their child to the high school felt relieved that the school really seemed to care about their children's needs. That is, at least before they discovered what really was happening. The school had a reputation for seeming so charitable because a lot of their students were orphans. The school was caring for children who might otherwise have nowhere to live. Some students at the school did have families, but they lived too far away to commute to school. Other families had financial restraints that meant they couldn't give their children proper attention they deserved, so they opted to have their children live on campus. With many of these families having both parents working, they knew that their child would be cared for and safe at this school. At least they should have been. Following the news of the incident coming out, a parent, Hong Eun-na, came forward as someone who had also reported a sexual assault committed in 2004. Mr. Jeon was not the first to file a complaint about the school, but his actions helped to create the momentum for more victims to come forward. But prior to this, it seemed that the police just really didn't care. The police were listening to statements made by the victims that were coming forward and had enough to arrest 6 people involved, although there were even more people involved who were mentioned as perpetrators. The police arrested the 2 brothers who were running the school, Principal Kim Kang-seok and the Vice Principal Kim Kang-jun, who were the sons of the Usuk Corporation's chairman. Along with them, they arrested arrested 2 kindergarten teachers, 1 grade school teacher, and an administrative staff member. The chairman's 3rd son was also rumored to be involved, however, there was not enough evidence against him to arrest him. During the trial that followed these arrests, the defense attorneys often brought up that the victims had disabilities, which they tried to use to dismiss their credibility. Some of the students who had intellectual disabilities had difficulty recalling information the same way each time, which the opposing attorneys used against them to state that they had been coached into lying or were confused about the situation. Although if there is anything we have learned from Olivia Benson of SVU, it is that even when a child lies, there is some truth. We must believe victims first, because there is so little for these children to gain from coming forward, and so much for them to lose. Some of the victims were orphans who had lived at the school. They were going to be placed in foster care because of this, most likely with caregivers who don't know sign language, or how to accommodate and properly care for a disabled child. Before learning about the trial, I need to make clear that these incidents did not happen outside of the scope of cameras in the school. I do not have an answer as to why the judge did not consider the CCTV footage as evidence, but in my research, it was brought up by victims, witnesses, parents, and civil rights groups that the police did have footage of at least some of the assaults that took place in classrooms and offices. However, instead they used only testimonies. My best guess is that the police either obtained the footage illegally, so therefore it couldn't be brought up in trial, or that the school went ahead and just deleted the tapes so that they couldn't be used. One of the victims testified against the principal who stood accused of sexual assault. The 13-year-old girl, who was a student at the school because of her profound hearing loss, had been taken out of her dormitory and forced into the principal's office. In his office, the young girl was sexually assaulted. This abuse would continue until it was reported 6 months later in 2005. The principal denied this and never wavered on his denial of the crime, but based on the fact that there were 2 graduate students who had witnessed girls being taken to his office, and that one of those boys had witnessed part of a sexual assault, along with the testimony of the victim, the principal was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But when he appealed the sentence, the trial really only focused on his perspective and how prison time would affect him and the school. So the judge agreed to reduce his sentence to 2 years and 6 months, along with 3 years of probation. The victim was treated so poorly. Difficulties arose in the trial as the Gwangju District Court at first would not supply a sign language interpreter for the trial. Keep in mind, many of the involved victims and testifying staff members were hard of hearing or deaf. This would impede the trial substantially. Finally, they found an interpreter, but they argued about the necessity of the interpreter for the entirety of the trial. The judge argued that the interpreter was only necessary when a deaf person was trying to communicate with them, and that the interpreter didn't need to be there for them to understand the rest of the trial. The victim's attorney protested this, stating, "You're treating deaf people as if they're fools." And they weren't wrong. Everyone, including those in the gallery, deserved to understand the entirety of that trial. Not only that, but the interpreter they did provide had only an elementary grasp on sign language and poorly interpreted to those who needed it. And because the interpreter was not very confident in their sign language, the defense attorney used this as an intimidation tactic when interviewing the victims. He consistently used difficult academic language when asking questions to the victims. Even if the interpreter did know these words, the children didn't. They asked the children, "Do you know the administrative director?" which was the vice principal's real title. None of the kids knew what this word was, and their attorney had to continually ask the defense attorney to just use simple language. One of the victims, who had graduated years prior, had gotten married in the meantime and had children. They came in to testify about being assaulted during their time at Inhwa Academy. But the defense attorney didn't ask her questions about her assault. Rather, He just kept returning back to the fact that she was married now and had a child. He insisted that someone who was raped couldn't or wouldn't get married and have children if they were so traumatized. The prejudice towards victims was so sickening to read about. Almost every victim had to go through such dehumanizing questioning. The vice principal, who was the perpetrator of the initial report that sparked this case, was looking at 12 years in prison. But at his first trial, he was only sentenced to 1 year in prison in 2005. Through the trial, the charges were changed from rape to forced molestation, despite protests from the prosecution. The victim who testified against the vice principal told about one of the many times she was assaulted. This victim was 17 years old at the time of the assault, or 18 in Korean age. The victim was a student at the school due to her moderate intellectual disability. The vice principal forced the girl into his office, tied her hands and feet, and sexually assaulted her. While she was being assaulted, a boy walked past the office and had heard noises coming from the room. He went to see what was happening, and because the office door was not closed all of the way, he saw part of the assault. And because of what he had seen, the vice principal ran out of his office and started to beat the boy with a glass soda bottle. He then grabbed a club and continued to beat the boy. He told him, "If you ever speak of this, I will kill you." The trauma of what he had witnessed and what he had experienced was too much for him, and later he would try to commit suicide by jumping off the building's roof. Thankfully, he survived his attempt, but he suffered major injuries. The boy at first did not want to testify because it was too difficult for him to remember. But later, he agreed to testify. He felt uncomfortable to speak in person about what had happened, so we used an online messaging program to detail what he had seen and what happened. This was shared with the attorney. He later would agree to testify in court, but unfortunately, neither his nor the victim's testimonies affected this sentencing, as the vice principal only received 1 year in prison. The judge determined that neither of the testimonies could be considered credible. The victim's testimony regarding the date of the assault and the witness's recollection didn't match up. As well, the statute of limitations on the crime had already passed, and since it was not reported soon enough after occurring, there was nothing they could do. The victim's attorney had tried to enter into evidence pictures of wounds on the girl's wrists that she said came from ropes he used to tie her up. However, the judge did not allow this to be entered into evidence, stating that they couldn't prove that this injury was related to the crime since so much time had passed. The ropes had left lasting marks on her wrists, which were now scars. Throughout the trial, because the judge did not view her testimony or the witnesses as credible, they were made to testify more than 10 times each. Their attorneys protested, stating that if the trial is restarted, this would be re-traumatizing the victims. They'd already relived their assault more than 10 times now by having to repeat their testimonies. It was just cruel. The first kindergarten teacher to be arrested, Lee Gu-hyun, was sentenced to 2 years and 6 months in prison for sexually assaulting a disabled kindergartner. The second kindergarten teacher was sentenced to 10 months in prison, but appealed this to reduce it to 2 years in probation. The grade school teacher was sentenced to 1 year in prison, but the statute of limitations had passed during their trial, and the indictment was dismissed. Their crimes were less publicly known, and most of the details of this case were kept private due to the victims being underage. However, it was revealed that the grade school teacher had decided to discipline a student by beating them with a wooden stick or paddle that they had in the school's laundry room. Unsatisfied, the teacher shoved the student's head inside of a spinning washing machine, which the student caught themselves from falling into with their hands, and their hands were badly injured from the washing machine. The teacher was able to evade punishment and in turn transferred to another special education school following the closure of Inhwa Academy. According to the parent of one of the victims, what is publicly known about what happened is only the tip of the iceberg of what happened inside Inhwa Academy. Faculty members had been habitually committing sexual violence against deaf and disabled students for the previous decade until they were arrested. The administrative workers' case was not brought to court. However, in a civil suit, the liability for the damage they caused was acknowledged, and the administrative worker had to pay 30 million won, which was later reduced to 20 million won, after they used the intoxication defense. They stated that because they were drunk, they committed the crime accidentally with impaired judgment. The institutions that were responsible for overseeing the investigation into the school's crimes, such as City Hall and Office of Education, were partly to blame as to why this trial lacked much evidence. In fact, this could have all been prevented because 2 years prior to Mr. Jeon reporting the crime to the police, Mrs. Hong, the parent of the victim, had reported the crime against her own child in 2004. This mother, Mrs. Hong, had contacted the Gwangju Deaf Association, who had received a few other complaints about the school as well. According to Kang Bok-won, a graduate of Inhwa Academy and president of the Inhwa Academy Alumni Association, he had visited the school in 2005 and was conducting interviews in regards to these complaints about sexual misconduct and assault. He'd received a text from a source that told him there appeared to be a sexual misconduct case happening at his old school. This wasn't something he wanted to take lightly, and he often worked to support disabled students. So as soon as he got the text, he made plans to visit the school. He met with a parent of a student who said that they had heard from a classmate that they had been sexually assaulted. Kang Bok-won went to the school as the president of the Alumni Association and first questioned the principal, who firmly said this didn't happen. The principal refused to answer any further questions. When they spoke to the victim, however, he learned the extent of the harassment and learned it was way worse than what he thought. He learned that this girl had been raped. Before he left, a female teacher and the principal came to say goodbye to him and slipped a thick envelope in his hands. He presumed that it was full of money. The principal started to beg him to exclude his name from the case and to not spread any rumors. Mr. Kang took the envelope and threw it away in front of them and left the school without saying anything. Then he went straight to the directors of the Gwangju Deaf Association and also spoke to the Alumni Association about what he had been told. He asked the Gwangju Deaf Association, "Is it true? Did you know about this?" After all, the victim said that they had reported it to them. The association just said, "Yes, but there's no evidence." Kang, seemingly being a rare good person, asked them, "Shouldn't we be the people to intervene?" But again, they told him, "There's no evidence for us to get involved." So they just ignored the reports entirely. Mr. Kang says it wasn't that they didn't just disbelieve the victim. They didn't want to believe that Principal Kim was involved. He believes that they played a part in covering up his crimes as well, but he couldn't prove it. Corruption was running very deep. Nothing would be done until Mr. Jeon was able to get attention on the crimes. Parents, students, advocates, human rights groups protested for months outside of the Office of Education, but nothing happened. As the vice principal and the other staff got out of serving most of their sentences, the Inhwa Academy, Usuk Corporation in particular, slowly started reinstating them all. They returned to work with children. In 2006, the principal passed away from pancreatic cancer. After his passing, novelist Gong Ji-young reignited interest in this case by publishing a book about it called Dogani, which means crucible. She was infuriated that these rapists were allowed near children again, let alone allowed near the victims they had assaulted. Teachers in the Gwangju area and across the nation were outspoken that there needed to be a harsher punishment against all of the perpetrators. A teacher replied to the court's ruling that giving a light punishment to the perpetrators of sexual assault of young disabled students on the grounds that the perpetrators, quote, reflected on their crimes and reached an agreement, unquote, is an action that ignores the suffering of the victims and their parents. I wholeheartedly agree. In 2011, they made a film of the book Dogani, which in English is titled Silenced. Dogani was published in 2009, and the film was made in 2011. Gong Ji-young has started writing her book in 2005, and this story brings life and context to what happened at Inhwa Academy through a semi-fictionalization. The film follows a similar story to one of the middle school girls who reported her assault. It is based off of the true story, but it is not a reflection of true events. However, it did open up a dialogue about the original case, which led to heavy criticism that the case was not handled correctly and that justice was not served. People who were involved in this case have said that there are some scenes in the movie that do reflect what truly happened, but the majority of the film is not a perfect recreation of what happened. Following the release of the film, a special investigation team was formed to reinvestigate this unresolved case. One of the students who testified in 2005 returned to retell their story that they had witnessed sexual violence at the school. However, when a lawsuit was brought forth in 2012, they lost this trial because the statute of limitations had passed. In this trial, they discovered 30 victims that were willing to come forward to testify that they had been harmed while under the care of Inhwa Academy. 26 of them stated they had been sexually assaulted. The victims testified that there were a total of 13 perpetrators involving the principal, the vice principal, multiple teachers, and rehabilitation teachers. In November 2011, the National Police Agency brought forth charges against 14 people, 13 perpetrators, and the chairman. But 7 of these people were not able to be prosecuted because of the statute of limitations. More than 150 alumni of Inhwa Academy gathered on October 17, 2011, as a reinvestigation into the heinous crimes that took place in Inhwa Academy began. A 71-year-old teacher, Kim Young-il, who had worked at Inhwa Academy, spoke at the press conference at Gwangju City Hall. He said something so shocking that it changed everyone's concept of what happened inside the school. He said, "I saw a dead little boy laying wrapped up in a sack. I dug the hole and buried him myself. Nobody knew that anyone had died at the school. What could have led to such an atrocity?" He continued that in October 1964, long before the school was rebranded as a home for deaf students, he had witnessed the vice principal come to take a student to his office late at night. The boy was an orphan who lived in the dormitories, and he was maybe 6 or 7 years old. The boy was incredibly small and thin for his age, but everyone knew that this was because children the principal thought was bad often were punished by withholding meals. The teacher explained this story as if this was just what schools were like at this time, as if there was nothing they could do. But it really doesn't excuse anyone who knew what was happening because they never tried to end the abuse. The boy had gone into the vice principal's office and suffered another punishment, this time being beaten until bruises were welting on his body. The vice principal was especially cruel this evening, and the boy died from the torture he endured. That is when the vice principal called for Kim Young-il, who walked in on the boy, covered by a sack on the ground. He ordered him to hide the body, and together they picked up the boy's corpse and loaded it into Vice Principal Kim's car. They drove in the night to the foot of Mount Mudung to bury the boy. This was more than 7 kilometers away from the school in a rural, forested area. Kim Young-il says that he lived in fear of the principal and vice principal. They were ruthless and would even physically assault teachers who they disliked for any given reason. He says that 6 months later, it happened again. Vice Principal Kim was an evil man who took out his frustrations on the younger students. His most common way of punishing the students was to starve them, the typical, "You're going to bed with no supper," except he took it to the extreme. It could be days before the students ate again. A 6-year-old girl was the subject of his next abusive tantrum. The girl was already starved from missing meals when the vice principal locked her in a room for days. Mr. Kim says that when the girl was finally let out, she had resorted to tearing wallpaper off of the walls to eat it. She was so hungry, she had to eat the wallpaper off the walls. Then, the girl suddenly disappeared one day, and it was later that Kim Young-il was told that the girl had been dropped by a caregiver at the school. She had died from this accidental drop and was secretly buried. It's likely that this meant that the girl had been pushed to her death or had died from malnutrition, abuse, or neglect, and this is how they were covering it up as an accident. With so much time passing, even if they did find these children's remains, it'd be difficult to tell what the cause of death was, but the statute of limitations would have passed. Everyone knew that the vice principal was abusing and neglecting students, and it wasn't just him. The punishment for bad students often was, "You're stupid and don't deserve food." That was what they told these young kids. After learning about the girl who had died, Kim Jong-il felt that he needed to go to the police. However, they dismissed his allegations because he couldn't find the bodies. He couldn't remember the exact location that they'd gone to in the dark of night, at the base of a mountain he didn't even remember how to get to. The boy's remains were lost, and he had never known where the girl was buried. The police officers must have also known the Kim family because when he returned to work, the principal and vice principal were waiting for him. They locked him in his office and began to beat him. He remembers being locked in his office for days, enduring physical assaults over those days. He was denied food and water until finally he was let out. He lived in fear at the school until he finally left in 1968. His allegations against the school, which were reported, were backed up by alumni who attended the school during this time. They reported that they had known the boy who had died and remember him disappearing suddenly. They thought he had run away. In the reinvestigation, they also discovered that the grade school teacher who escaped punishment in the first trial had a history of similar behavior, enough to be considered a pattern of behavior. This teacher, whose name was not revealed, was accused of sexually harassing and abusing students. What was not publicly known yet was that this teacher also had been previously investigated in 1996 for forcibly kissing and molesting a 12-year-old student at Inhwa Academy. This was not known until the statute of limitations had also passed on this crime. He cannot be punished for either of these crimes now. And after all of the charges against him were dismissed, he went on to work at another special education school. The last update I can find about his status was in 2014. However, at this time he was close to retirement age, so it's likely he is no longer a teacher. Kim Jong-il wasn't the only one to speak out at the press conference in 2011. Kang Bo-kwan, a member of the Gwangju Association for the Deaf, who had attended and graduated from Inhwa Academy, backed up allegations against the third and youngest Kim brother that many others said as well, but they didn't have enough evidence against him to include him in the initial trial. However, Kang recalled that when he was at the school in 1975, he witnessed the third Kim son, who was studying painting in college at the time, calling in female students to go to his office. He would ask the students to pose nude for his paintings and sketches. He regularly did this, although his victims have not come forward. Everyone just knew what was happening. Kang said he had witnessed it on several occasions. The Kim family had a residence on the second floor of the school where they lived. They'd made a nice apartment-like living quarters for themselves so that they could oversee the school at all hours. This also meant that they had access to the children at all times. This youngest brother went on to become a middle school teacher at a public school. Allegedly, he was the perpetrator of the sexual assault of a teacher at Inhwa as well. However, the only reference to this sexual assault is by Pastor Kim Young-mok, a member of the Inhwa Sexual Violence Countermeasure Committee. The victim may have spoken to him, but I couldn't find any other information about this. Because the crimes committed against these young, vulnerable students were not taken seriously, the perpetrators were allowed to continue to victimize more children. It's unlikely that their crimes stopped in 2005 because a lot of those teachers were reinstated. At least by 2005, more than half of their students had transferred or dropped out of the school. They only had 22 students remaining, most of whom were actively working with the committee to leave. In efforts to ensure justice is served in the future, the National Assembly passed a revision to the Special Act on the Punishment of Sex Crimes. They increased the punishment of sex crimes committed against children and disabled people. Specifically, this trial had so much mitigated punishment because the victims had challenges testifying or relaying what happened to them. Some of them had even received threats to stay silent or rescind their complaints. If a victim withdrew their complaint, then no one could be punished. There's no victim, there's no crime. The school principal avoided heavy punishment and received a suspended sentence because the victim withdrew their complaint. They came to a private settlement. This is likely because they were bribed or threatened. This method has been abused throughout history, and victims fear coming forward because there's very few protections for them. It's because of this that feminist human rights groups and victim advocate groups have come forward to protest that these laws only serve to protect the perpetrators. The government abolished the complaint law that allowed people to rescind their complaints in 2011 for disabled people. It was applied to all sex crime complaints in 2013. But that wasn't the only legal problem in this case. It was because of the school's nepotistic hiring practices that these crimes were hidden for so long. So many of the staff were related to or were family friends of the Kim family. The Social Welfare Services Act stipulated that all social welfare programs or corporations must now have a third of all directors as external hires elected or recommended by the local community council. What this meant was a third of their board of directors must be community appointed, preventing nepotism or situations in which a group of people who are already conspiring together control a work environment. Specifically, this only applies to welfare programs like schools, charities, or churches. But it was a necessary change. This really didn't go over well with religious organizations who didn't believe that the government had any right to say who should be elected into their church. This brings up the importance of separation of church and state, but I'll allow you to form your own opinions on this matter. After this incident, Usak Corporation attempted to change the school's name to try to fix their tarnished reputation. They wanted to name the school Sayang School and expand their services to all special education for students with disabilities with hearing or speaking. They also wanted to include more intellectual disabilities in their program. However, the public never once took their eyes off of the actions of the school and continued to protest in front of it. Civil rights groups demanded that the school should shut their doors forever because the Usak Corporation cannot be trusted with children. This led to an audit of the Usak Corporation that resulted in their license to operate being revoked in October 2011. The city absorbed almost all of the company's assets, and Inhwa Academy closed a few months later after rehoming the boarding students. The school was demolished, and in its place was a new facility for disabled people managed by the city. Inhwa Academy was no more. If we go back to the reinvestigation that happened in 2011, the prosecution was able to reintroduce testimonies and introduce new testimonies from new victims who were assaulted, leading to the vice principal receiving a 12-year prison sentence, which was higher than the 10-year sentence they were asking for, as well as he received 10 years of wearing a tracking monitor. Later, when he tried to appeal this, it was reduced to 8 years of prison time. Between 2005 and 2011, he had not returned to working in schools after Inhwa Academy closed. Instead, he was working various hard labor jobs and had resulted in him losing one of his arms. The judge, for some reason, considered this when lessening his sentence. In 2013, he started his prison sentence for aggravated rape since the victim was found to have severe PTSD to this day. The attorney representing the victims had to fight to have the victim's trauma recognized in court because at the time, rape was treated as just a physical assault, the same as like if you beat someone up. He has since been released to be monitored, but his whereabouts and identity are not public information. He has likely changed his name. The judge ruled that the defendant sexually assaulted a victim with a speech impediment and intellectual disability, causing the victim to suffer from PTSD, and that he repeatedly struck and injured a hard of hearing second victim who witnessed the assault. This trial would conclude the Tokani trials because none of the other crimes were able to be tried. Their statute of limitations had passed. But there are so many more testimonies of crimes that couldn't be tried. Park Eun-hye, the middle school student who spoke about the lack of teachers who communicated in sign language, also had a lot to say about the misconduct of teachers and staff at the school. As class was dismissed, One day, she grabbed her snacks to go outside and eat with her upperclassmen friends. It was in the evening and it was starting to get dark, but there was only one light on in the administrative office. The teacher came out and told her, "Come quickly, look at my computer." Her friend went outside with the others and Eun-hae called after her saying she'd be right there. She followed the teacher to his office and walked around his desk to look at his computer. On his computer was an adult video playing. She froze when she saw what it was. She'd never seen anything like that. She didn't know what to do or what to say because this was such an uncomfortable situation for her. But when she tried to leave, between her and the door was her teacher, standing with his pants down, and he was masturbating at her. She has tried so hard to suppress this traumatic memory because it made her feel so dirty. She tried to forget it. But earlier that year, a classmate of hers who had an intellectual disability had confessed to her that they had been sexually assaulted by their teacher. At first, she couldn't believe what her friend was telling her. Then, following the incident with her teacher, the same teacher started offering her candy or money to come visit his office at night. She knew what would happen if she did, so she always stayed in the dormitory with the others, making sure to never be alone with him again. Park Eun-hae's upperclassman, Jung Jie, was shocked when she heard that someone from her school had been sexually assaulted. Jie came to Inhwa Academy in 2002 when she was in the 4th grade. When she came to the school, there were only 4 other 4th graders and she was the only girl. She had to make friends with upper and lower classmen just to have friends. Jie's teacher was one of the first to join the school, a teacher who started prior to it being a school for deaf children, so her teacher did not know sign language. She still had some hearing ability, so she tried her best to learn from the teacher, but it was clear that her classmates were learning nothing from the lectures. Jie hadn't learned sign language because her hearing loss was only moderate, so she tried her hardest to learn to talk to her new friends. The teachers who didn't know sign language just wrote everything on the board and let the students copy it down. Jie's parents brought her to school each day, so she quickly became popular. The students who lived on the dormitories couldn't go shopping or get treats, so they would give Jie their allowance from their families or savings that they had, and Jie would come back with chips, ramen, soda, or ice creams. Some of the students found out that when the principal went to sleep, they could hop over the school's fence and sneak to a nearby store and buy ramyeon. It was cheap at only 500 won, so the children could afford it, and it was tasty enough that it was something they could look forward to. Without being able to leave the school year-round, they were beginning to go a little stir-crazy. They had no TVs, no magazines, no playgrounds, no toys. There was nothing to do except talk and study. Jie tried to bring them toys whenever she could because she felt bad for how boring it must have been to live there. She had no clue that they were also being abused. Because everyone really liked her, she quickly became the class president. That is when she heard of Park Eun-hae's story. She called all of the other class presidents together and invited Eun-hae to tell her story. The students could only trust one another. None of them knew the sign for rape, but they all understood what had happened. When they asked her who hurt her, she pointed to a picture of Mr. Jeon. Mr. Jeon was the teacher who had helped another student report her rape just earlier that year, but the other students expressed doubt because they knew that he was a good teacher. So she caved and confessed that the person who assaulted her made her promise to never tell anyone who they were or that she would be hurt again. She said that since she revealed that she was assaulted, she had been beaten, harassed, and sexually harassed by many more teachers, including female teachers. Jie stood by her classmates in participating in protests. She even helped throw eggs and flowers at the principal and vice principal when they came in. She witnessed as the deaf teachers at her school were also victimized by fellow staff. She hoped that the education system for deaf children would improve someday. Of the deaf or hard of hearing teachers, Mr. Jeon was not the only one who tried to stand up for what is right. Miss Park Hyun-jung was the newest teacher to work at Inhwa, and she had been working there since the age of 26. In 2005, she was 35 and still was the youngest staff member. Because she was the lowest on the hierarchy of teachers, she hadn't made any connections with any of the other teachers, even after being there for 9 years. Because she was so lonely at the school, she'd never heard any of the drama, any of the rumors. She'd never even learned about anyone's weekend plans. However, she was one of the only qualified teachers to be working in special education. Miss Park had earned her degree in counseling psychology and special education at grad school. Despite her being more qualified than even the senior teachers, it didn't matter because of that concept of Inhwa. If she spoke up during staff meetings, she would be met with a, "You're lucky you can eat and live thanks to this company." The atmosphere encouraged subservience. She never felt respected or even welcomed for that matter. The principal and vice principal brothers would keep track of who got them gifts for holidays even. And if you didn't bring them a gift, they'd write your name on a big blackboard in the staff room. Then they'd scold you like a student in front of everyone. Miss Park said that she felt a stronger connection to her students than she did the other staff. Eventually, she decided that she'd had enough of this boys' club and quit. 4 months after she left was when the press conference announced the Inhwa Academy sexual assault case. Although she had already left the school, she knew that she needed to get involved. She was still active in the teachers' union, so she reached out to the countermeasure committee to get involved in the protests. They asked her to visit the school and try to see if there were any additional cases of sexual violence or misconduct. They also wanted her to try to find more teachers who were willing to speak out against the school. She worked alongside Mr. Jeon Eung-seop, who offered both Korean Sign Language and exact sign language. Korean Sign Language, like many other sign languages, is abbreviated and has its own signs for phrases and its own grammar. Exact sign language is often used by early learners or when signing to someone using another dialect. Even within Korea, there are different dialects of sign language, just as there are different dialects of Korean. Miss Park and Mr. Jeon helped to collect information from students and aided MBC's PD Suchop, or Producer's Note, which is an investigative journalism TV show that was going to run a series of episodes on the case. The question that Miss Park wanted to answer was, how did these happen as such an open secret, yet her and Mr. Jeon had no idea that anything, even neglect, was happening? Well, she discovered the secret. Most of the assaults were happening at night, over the weekend, when the staff was not there. If you recall, the principal and vice principal and other family members had a living area on the second floor of the building. They were always there. They tied the children up so they couldn't run, and they played loud music during the sexual assaults. The students were threatened not to speak, which worked for a while. It should be noted that when Miss Park was learning about these incidents, so was Gwangju, who went on to write the book Dokani. Dokani is a work of fiction based off of the truth. So not all incidents that happened in the book or in the movie that came later are real. Although there are some scenes that seem like very close recreations, specifically a laundry room scene is said to be very accurate. Although I have not watched the movie yet, I will be watching it with my patrons this weekend. Many details were changed to protect the victims and to avoid revealing too much identifying information, of course. Miss Park heard more testimonies of assaults that happened, and it shocked her just how many students were harmed while she was still at the school. One of the teachers, who was a rehabilitation teacher for deaf students, had even assaulted a male student. This would be the first case of a male student being assaulted that they'd heard of. And with the stigma of being labeled gay, especially in the early 2000s, it was unlikely that if there were more victims that they would come forward. During a school trip that Miss Park went on, a student reported that she had been sleeping when an administrative staff member came and sexually assaulted her while covering her mouth. Another student had woken up and seen the staff member leaving quickly. Miss Park had no idea that this had happened while she had been sleeping in the same room. She knew that she had to stand up for the students and stand up against the teachers who were still on the academy's side. Her efforts helped lead to the school's closure, as well as funding for the new school that opened. Many of the former students at Inhwa Academy did not have a way to be independent or make their own money following the school's closure. They lived in a culture that was not yet accommodating for disabled people, and still to this day has a very long way to go. In December 2011, Cafe Holda opened as a place that deaf and hard of hearing employees can work and earn their independence. Holda comes from two words, 홀로삶, which means life alone, and 더불삼, which means life together. A second branch opened in 2013 and it appears to still be open to this day. The second branch lists that it is ran by a manager named Jihae, but it's unclear if this is the Jihae involved in the case or not. If you find yourself in Gwangju, pop in for a visit and help support a great cause. The cafe has a victim support fund as well that can help deaf victims with living expenses and aid in finding work. If I was still living in Korea, I would absolutely go, but in the meantime, I'll add it to my Naver Map favorites. Following the conclusion of the Dokani trials, Mr. Jeon went on to become the director of Sign Language Interpretation Center in Ulsan, and he has dedicated his life to fighting for the rights of disabled people. A sentiment that I saw often in this case is 소 잃고 외양간 고친다, which means to fix the barn after your cow escapes. It might sound pessimistic, but the criticism is you're trying to fix a situation only now that the worst has already happened, when you could have prevented it from happening. Of course, it's easy to say, this should have been prevented, but now that it's happened, we should ensure that it doesn't happen again. Children should be protected in all situations that they are vulnerable, whether that be at home or in school. They trust adults in their lives to care for them because they have no alternative. These children deserved better from the adults in their lives. Thankfully, the victims in this case were able to receive free psychological care for their trauma, and it was because of the good-hearted people in this case that these victims were able to come forward about the abuse they had endured. As someone who was taught for 6 going on 7 years, students are trusting us to take care of them. And someone who violates that trust does not deserve to teach children. They deserve to face justice. Thank you for listening to today's episode. As always, join us on Discord for free movie nights. I just love to watch movies with you guys. Find my sources on Patreon. We have a quarterly sticker club on Patreon as well. Be sure to leave a review, a written one if you can, and follow the show wherever you listen. Thank you to my patrons, Vix Mac, Lala, William White, G1 Edwards, Nico, Elijah Hancock, Anomanom, Dr. Bob, Lumos, Emma Brown, David Tafoya, Adriana, Pip, Dade512, Lisa, Veronica, Olive, Caitlin, Missy G, and Sharon Evans. Thank you for making this show possible. 다음에 또 봐요. See you next time.